Dark screens flicker as thousands refresh wallet balances while promised gains evaporate. A sudden collapse that rips weeks of trust away and leaves overnight ruin, frantic messages, and cold disbelief in its wake. Someone calls a pastor between payments, whispering about stolen retirement. Believers ask if divine justice will answer financial betrayal, blending prayer and law into a trembling hope for reckoning. Regulatory notices flicker onto screens as investigators map wallets and shell companies. A labyrinth of code and human cunning where every address becomes a breadcrumb toward truth or yet another erasure. A montage of victims appears: retirees, young entrepreneurs, single parents. Their testimony shows trust weaponized, turning ledger entries into faces, voices, and stories that demand moral reckoning from strangers and states. On social feeds, triumphant founders post curated sunrise shots while comment threads explode with questions. The curated gospel collides with forensic evidence, exposing narrative control as essential to the fraud. Lawyers in suits trace unusual flows through privacy chains, subpoenaing exchanges and shell entities. Their sterile offices becoming battlegrounds where the language of faith, contract, and criminality collide. Meanwhile, clerics in small chapels answer late-night calls, translating accounting jargon into spiritual counsel, promising that ultimate justice may not be monetary but will address the imbalance between liar and lied. A whistleblower appears on a cracked screen livestream, voice trembling while a ledger screenshot scrolls behind them, naming pseudonymous wallets and promising a data dump that could topple reputations. Investigative journalists pore over leaked spreadsheets, triangulating timestamps and transactions, their newsroom walls plastered with red strings and post-its that begin to sketch a pattern too coherent to be accidental. In courtrooms, a single ledger entry becomes evidence of intent, an accountant testifying about obfuscated keys, rendering abstract cryptography into human motive, legal jeopardy, and potential prison time for architects of deception. Yet in private Discord servers, celebratory emojis replace conscience, traders trade insider warnings for more leverage, and a culture of impunity grows under layers of anonymity and techno-optimism. Families gather in kitchens, comparing dwindling portfolios. Someone points to a printed white paper as if it was scripture, and anger mixes with bewilderment as legal recourse feels distant and complicated. Blockchain analysts reveal small, repeated siphons from newcomer wallets, a micro-theft pattern hidden beneath market noise, suggesting a deliberate architecture designed to avoid single-point detection and to normalize losses as typical volatility. An ex-developer speaks on camera, admitting code was crafted to reroute dust transactions. Their remorse is raw, but their confession exposes an industry tolerance for plausible deniability and regulatory blind spots that enable concealment. At midnight, a small group of victims organize, drafting a collective suit and crowdfunding evidence collection. Their resolve signals a shift from private lament to public demand for accountability and restitution. The blockchain's promise of trustless systems attracted regulators late, allowing evangelists to conflate decentralization with immunity. A semantic gap exploited to delay oversight while money moved faster than ethics. Marketing decks framed risk as faith, urging believers to ignore doubt, trust algorithms, and evangelize returns, transforming speculative finance into a quasi-religious movement resistant to skepticism and external authority. Venture capital flowed despite warnings, incentivizing growth over governance, as token launches rewarded speed, not scrutiny, embedding moral hazard deep within funding structures, celebrated as innovation. Exchanges competed for volume, listing assets with minimal diligence, because fees scaled with frenzy, creating a race where gatekeeping felt like self-sabotage in an overheated market. Jurisdictional arbitrage fragmented enforcement, founders hopping borders digitally, hosting servers offshore, exploiting legal gray zones where responsibility dissolved between agencies and continents. Influencers monetized credibility, live streaming testimonials, while disclaimers whispered legality, turning parasocial trust into a distribution channel that outpaced traditional advertising and evaded accountability. Religious language surfaced repeatedly, from promised blessings to tests of faith, reframing losses as spiritual trials, subtly discouraging victims from reporting fraud or questioning leaders. Data shows complaint spikes lagging collapses as shame delayed reporting, allowing perpetrators time to launder proceeds, erase trails, and rebrand under new tokens and identities. Platform terms buried arbitration clauses, limiting class actions, while complex onboarding normalized consent fatigue, effectively muting consumer protection through design choices, masquerading as efficiency. Security audits became performative, snapshots in time, rather than continuous oversight, enabling teams to pass checks, then quietly alter code paths once public attention faded. Whistleblowers faced retaliation and doxing, a chilling effect amplified by online mobs, reinforcing silence while perpetrators framed critics as enemies of progress. Regulators admitted talent gaps, struggling to recruit cryptography experts, leaving enforcement understaffed against adversaries, fluent in code, finance, and psychological manipulation. In this vacuum, theology-filled space policy left empty, as pastors improvised guidance on digital sin, accountability, and restitution, shaping community responses beyond legal remedies. Analysts traced donation flows to religious fronts, laundering reputations, alongside funds, complicating prosecution, where charity intersected with commerce and belief. The system revealed itself not as a single villain, but an ecosystem optimized for speed, belief, and plausible deniability, where fraud thrived as an emergent property. A whistleblower's dataset detonates online, independent analysts verify hashes, decentralized forensics begin unraveling obfuscation, turning secrets into evidence and shifting narrative power back to victims, advocates, and truth-seeking networks. Prosecutors coordinate cross-border seizures, freezing wallets at midnight, and shutting down shell servers, while extradition battles signal states can mobilize, despite technical complexity, political resistance, and porous international legal frameworks that once sheltered perpetrators. Civic hackers form volunteer task forces, mapping donation trees and tagging beneficiaries. Their grassroots dashboards democratize investigation, converting scattered grief into collective, actionable intelligence that fuels prosecutions and public pressure. Pastors, survivors, and lawyers convene town halls, demanding reparations, translating moral language into legal leverage and negotiating settlements that bind spiritual restitution to financial redress and community oversight mechanisms. Smart contracts are rewritten, and auditors adopt continuous monitoring protocols, spawning a remediation industry that melds software discipline with consumer protection law to prevent the exact vulnerabilities that enabled earlier thefts. A landmark conviction shocks markets and narratives. A founder is sentenced after forensic cryptography traced intent, reframing blockchain from immutable escape into accountable ledger subject to civilian law and moral scrutiny. Class action suits consolidate thousands of dispersed microclaims. Pro bono attorneys assemble transaction histories into coherent economic narratives, transforming individual tragedies into systemic evidence courts can finally adjudicate with real remedy potential. Cryptoeconomic incentives shift as exchanges enforce stricter listings, reputation oracles gain traction, and token designers internalize duties of transparency, altering market grammar that previously rewarded opacity and speculative spectacle. Victims reclaim agency by pooling microclaims into collective legal wallets and coordinated pressure campaigns, enabling targeted asset freezes, investigative grants, and sustained reputational consequences for platforms that enabled fraud. A new theology emerges in sermons and podcasts, asserting that restitution is both spiritual duty and civic necessity, prompting congregations to demand ethical investment, transparent stewardship, and accountability from religiously affiliated projects. Tech firms build automated auditors and ML detectors to flag anomalous flows in near real time, reducing detection lag and converting surveillance tools into instruments of consumer defense rather than exploitation by insiders. International accords materialize to standardize exchange cooperation, harmonize freeze protocols, build rapid response channels, and streamline evidence sharing, shrinking jurisdictional loopholes that once let criminal networks dissolve across borders with impunity. Media narratives pivot from hype to investigative depth, elevating victims' testimony and technical explanation over founder charisma, reshaping public sentiment toward accountability, reparations, and skepticism of blind evangelism. Social platforms alter recommendation systems to deprioritize promise-heavy pitches and deceptive endorsements, reducing viral amplification of predatory projects, improving user warnings, and forcing marketing strategies to adapt under greater scrutiny. Restorative justice panels pilot community-centered remedies that combine public acknowledgement, mandated restitution, and educational mandates for perpetrators, testing whether moral repair can accompany legal consequence and restore fractured trust. Legislatures convene emergency sessions, drafting restitution statutes that mandate frozen asset auctions, victim compensation funds, and compliance audits, turning scandal into legal architecture designed to deter future predators and restore public confidence. Global philanthropic pools seed victim recovery programs. Independent monitors audit distributions, and NGOs teach financial literacy, converting collective grief into structured resilience and rebuilding trust through transparency, accountability, and sustained community support. Industry coalitions publish strict ethical codes, mandatory disclosure standards, and third-party reputation oracles. Startups face bond requirements and governance audits, reshaping incentive structures to favor long-term stewardship over short-term speculation. Engineers implement immutable provenance layers, continuous audits, and machine learning anomaly detectors embedded at protocol layers, making fraudulent reroutes visible within seconds and converting distributed ledgers into increasingly defensible public goods. Influencers who once amplified dubious launches now face reputational audits, public contrition tours, and legal exposure, catalyzing a cultural reckoning where credibility becomes a guarded currency rather than cheap clout. Survivors start micro-enterprises, teach community workshops, and form mutual aid cooperatives, turning losses into civic capital while narrative control shifts from charismatic founders to grounded, locally accountable leaders. Universities and seminaries launch interdisciplinary programs, exploring technology, ethics, and theology, producing a new generation of leaders fluent in both code and conscience, who critique markets through moral reasoning. Artists and filmmakers create memorial works that humanize statistics, installations that map stolen flows into physical space, and oral histories that insist victims' stories outlive market noise and forgetfulness. Policymakers tie prevention to economic inclusion, funding digital literacy, affordable banking alternatives, and regulatory sandboxes that prioritize consumer safety, aiming to stop scams before trust becomes currency for exploitation. In a packed hall, victims confront a founder, voices cracking as testimonies collide with glossy past promises. The scene becomes a sacred indictment where legal guilt and spiritual condemnation converge into public moral pressure. A filmed testimony of a single mother goes viral, catalyzing global outrage, prompting emergency hearings, and crystallizing public demand for restitution, as empathy transforms into legislative momentum and sustained accountability. Some perpetrators apologize publicly, enter restorative programs, and assist in reparations. Others deny culpability, fueling polarized debates about sincerity, punishment, and whether confession can substitute for concrete restitution. Landmark sentences set precedents, courts authorize broader asset forfeiture, and judgments favor victims, signaling that technological complexity no longer shields moral wrongdoing from severe legal consequences, and international cooperation increases. Clergy preach accountability as sacred duty, scholars map sin to systems, and communities hold both perpetrators and institutions to moral account, asserting that spiritual and civic justice are inseparable in modern financial life. The final image lingers on an empty wallet beside a child's drawing. Voices from the trial echo, restitution remains partial, trust, fragile, and the question persists. Who will guard the vulnerable when money masquerades as salvation? If money becomes faith and profit replaces truth, who do you believe should deliver justice? Courts, code, or God? Markets can fail. Laws can lag, but history shows this again and again. Fraud always leaves a trace, and judgment, sooner or later, arrives.